Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Culture Calls, a monthly podcast by Culturelytics, where we talk all about culture in organizations, why it matters, and how leaders can get to grips with it. Today, we have a very special session. I'm really pleased to be talking with Sir Richard Shirreff about the valuable lessons that business leaders can learn from the experience of military leadership in aligning culture and strategy. Richard was born in Kenya and educated at Oxford before taking up a career in the British Army. He served in the Army for 37 years, becoming a 4-star general and finishing his service as Deputy Supreme Commander in Europe for the NATO military alliance. In these roles, he has extensive experience in building unity of purpose and effort among governments, humanitarian groups, and many other stakeholders to resolve highly complex problems. Since retiring from the military, Richard co-founded and is managing partner of Strategia Worldwide, a global strategic risk advisory firm based in London that helps companies understand, test, and manage risk to build resilience and protect business value. So welcome, Richard. We're really pleased to have you here on Culture Calls.
Well, thank you very much, and it's a great pleasure to be with you.
Great. So let's start just a little bit about you. Can you just tell us maybe a little bit more about yourself and perhaps why, after leaving the military, you founded Strategia?
Well, as you said, I spent 37 years as a soldier. When the time came to come to an end, I started thinking and walking and talking, and I met a very inspirational woman who at that stage was one of the leading headhunters in London, who it was just in the wake, actually, of the Gulf of Mexico disaster, BP's saga with Macondo in 2010. And she said, look, I think you might want to have a look at risk in the extractive industries, because the mining and oil companies are really worried about the extent to which they've got risk cover. They're looking at what's happened to BP, and they're now looking at themselves. So I did. And what I did some research, and I freely admit it was pretty, it was not in-depth research, but it was enough to really get a sense that I thought that many of the examples I looked at appeared to be looking pretty tactically at risk. They weren't joining up the dots, so they weren't understanding the relationships between risk. Now, this was something that in the military, we had really learnt the hard way. Iraq, Afghanistan will not go down in history as successful campaigns, largely because of a failure of strategy. But certainly at my level, we really focused on building bridges with multiple stakeholders, understanding the relationships between risk, and really thinking right to left in terms of identify where you need to get to, work back, which is the essence of strategy design, through a series of decisive conditions along a series of pathways to achieve the objectives which will unlock the vision or desired end state. And I thought this could be relevant. So that germ of an idea was put there. I then found myself being promoted and sent off to NATO, which gave me invaluable experience both in the multinational world of the alliance, but also at a strategic level. And then when I came out, for various reasons, I thought, well, let's give it a go. I'd never run a business before. I was keen to find a new start. And so I set up the business on my own. And in a sense, the rest is history. I met my business partner a year later, and here we are. Well, now I left in 2014, so here we are 9 years later. And we've been operating as a partnership for just over 7 years now.
That's great. So actually applying lessons that you learned in the military to business strategy and the approaches to risk.
Yeah, applying lessons learned in the military, but in a business context, and learning, of course, a huge amount about different businesses, because we've worked across different sectors in mining, in oil and gas, in infrastructure, pharmaceuticals, real estate, media, because any organization, any business organization has got to be able to think strategically about its objectives and how it's going to get there. It's got to understand how to manage risk. It's got to build resilience into it. But of course, coming back in a sense to culture, it's got to have the right culture, the right values, the right leadership.
Very interesting. So that does lead me to my next question. And speaking of strategy, we all, of course, know Peter Drucker's dictum about, culture eats strategy for breakfast. It was intended for businesses, And in this podcast, we talk to a lot of business leaders out there trying to shape their company culture. But I'm just wondering if that has also, in your experience, both in the military and as a business risk advisor, is it also ring true? Is culture essential to military strategy, to risk strategy, and particularly perhaps with your experience working globally and working on the military side with multinational forces?
I think culture underpins everything, yes. And what do we mean by culture? I mean, I think culture is about the tone set by the leadership, the values on which an organization is, which are the foundation on which any organization, I think, is built. And however clever, however sophisticated there may be, a strategy might be, it's not going to work unless people buy into it. And similarly, in a business sense, I mean, I learned pretty quickly on a major project in Latin America, which of course you know well. We designed together a very successful strategy. But the one thing we did not do was to really do it in an integrated way with the client. And so the client felt that it was, in a sense, being presented to them rather than they didn't feel they bought into it. And actually, I don't think as a result of that, the lessons were learnt, the strategy was implemented in quite the way that we had hoped it would be. But coming back to the military, I mean, it is absolutely about values and the foundations of values. And these are not just moral nice to haves, they're functionally indispensable. Values such as courage, integrity, respect for others, loyalty, all of these things really matter, because unless, particularly in a military world, if you're operating in a world where the risks to life and limb are as high as they are, you have to be able to depend on your brothers and sisters in arms, quite genuinely. Otherwise, the mission is not going to get done. Now, I'm not saying it's as extreme in business. Thank God it's not as extreme in business. But nevertheless, I think a values-based organization where the values are not just nice to haves come up with, dreamt up by a marketing agency, but they are fundamentally imprinted in the culture of the organization so that people live those values every day. And trust, of course, comes into that as well. Then I think an organization can begin to build the strategies to achieve what it needs to achieve.
Right. So as a strategic risk advisor, would you say that culture can be a source of strategic risk if you don't get it right?
Absolutely. Absolutely, it can. The wrong culture can undermine everything that an organization is setting out to do. I mean, just take, one of the core values of the British Army is respect for others. Well, that goes to the whole issue of, in a world of Me Too, I need say nothing more. Respect for race, respect for gender, respect for each other as individuals is fundamental, because where there is division and any sort of toxic behavior will just undermine the purpose of any organization.
Right. And let me get a little bit to the how. So you mentioned a minute ago that culture just can't be something you deal with in a superficial way. It can't be a marketing line. It's got to inculcate, be embedded in the organization. So talk to me a little bit about the how. How do leaders get to grips with culture? How do leaders ensure that they are, instilling the right culture in the organization? I think, again, throwing another quote at you, former GE CEO Jack Welch said that sometimes it's the soft stuff that's the hard stuff. So how do you get to grips with building the right culture in an organization?
It's a two-way process, I think. I mean, firstly, I think every organization has in a sense, a dynamic of its own. And that dynamic has been built up over the years of the history of the organization. And in a sense, it's the contribution of everybody who has been part of that organization, everybody who has led it. Because we all, in a sense, we set the tone, we set the conditions for our successors. And if you have an organization where the values are right, the discipline is right, the the insistence on maintenance of standards is right, then those values will be laid down over time, and the organization builds up a sort of a life in a sense of its own. And if the organization, you know, if the culture is right and the organization is right, then it's relatively straightforward for a leader to come in. Of course, much more difficult for a new leader coming into an organization where the culture may not be right. And I guess this is really gets to the heart of leadership, which is all about inspiring people to do willingly and well what you would like them to do. And that's about personal example. It's about personal qualities. We all come up with a list of characteristics a leader might have. But again and again, I think I go back to, you know, the line, as always, as so often, we turn back to Winston Churchill, and what he talked about was courage being the first virtue among leaders, because from it flow all others. In the military context, or in some organizations, that might require physical courage. But in any organization, it requires moral courage, the courage to make and take difficult decisions. And of course, through personal characteristics, you can, in a sense, set the example of behavior and the way to operate, which will flow down and be copied and emulated by others in the organization. So you've got to live it. You know, you've got to live the truth and live the business. It's also about communication. It's also about empathy, understanding, tapping into people's concerns, their fears, and being able to reassure them. And then I think it's also about setting the goals clearly. It's about empowering people. It's about ensuring that people understand what you want to them, what the intent is, giving them the resources to achieve it, and then letting them get on with it to use their initiative without the long screwdriver trying to direct them. And again, in some organizations I've seen that have gone wrong, it's that attempt at over control that undermines and stymies an organization. But for empowerment, you've got to have trust, and trust takes time to build. And it comes from living, working, training, operating together, because then you can begin to build that trust which any organization needs.
That's a fascinating list between values, you know, inspiring leadership, empowering leadership, and trust. And those are all fascinating elements. Let me ask you, and you may not, but any particular examples you might be able to share about where you've seen where there was a need to either shift the culture or build a culture, and you've seen it be successfully done, whether from your military career or your private sector career, or perhaps where it was missing.
Well, I mean, it's a tricky one, this. I mean, I've certainly seen outstanding leadership in the military. Two individuals come to mind: a man called Scott Grant, who commanded a brigade I was a senior staff officer in, and General Sir Charles Guthrie, Lord Guthrie, who was an outstandingly successful multinational commander at a very senior level, 4-star. And on both occasions, it was about the clarity of intent, setting the tone, living the tone, leading by example, but also, particularly at the higher level, I think certainly Lord Guthrie, this ability to, and in multinational context too, an ability to embrace and understand the concerns and the needs of individual nations and national contingents. The ability to make all feel as part of a united, homogenous team, and the ability in a quiet way, but nevertheless quiet but very, very strong, to lead quietly behind through persuasion rather than through, you know, through overt, what you might call upfront direction. As for things going wrong, where it goes wrong, I mean, there are warning signs. The warning signs of toxic leadership, control, abusive emails, the tone of emails. These are all warning signs. And I think the only advice or the best advice one can give is where there are these warning signs, forgive me, confront them early, step up and say, look, this is not right. And then I think you have to be, this is where, again, where a bit of moral courage comes in. You've got to be prepared to not to put up with bad behavior. And we all know what bad behavior is.
Yeah. Yes. And I suppose also warning signs when you see the consequences of that behavior. If you see people reluctant to perform tasks or to be innovative in response to challenges.
Exactly. And over control. The long screwdriver coupled with that bad behavior, these are real warning signs. But there's also another sign. This is not, I can think of other organizations where, for example, the motto was, good news takes the elevator, bad news takes the stairs. In other words, where there's good news, people are only too happy to tell people. Where things are not going right, people are not always prepared to tell their senior leadership that they're not going right. And senior leadership proceed on the basis that all's well. And then in organizational terms, you can see how organizations can grow very quickly and can't adapt, in a sense, rather like a 17-year-old teenager who's suddenly gone from 4'9" to 6'3" in no time at all. They haven't managed to catch up with themselves, and so their organizations need to be thinking about organizational integration, I think, as an organization evolves, and be prepared to look critically at yourself or be looked at critically.
So for fast-growing organizations or in, say, business environments where there's lots of change, don't forget culture.
Culture, fundamental. And go back and keep, don't take anything for granted. And so often, I think, the day-to-day demands of day-to-day, the business, keep maintaining the business, finding the business, making the business work. Yeah. Leaders need to be able to step back, think, listen, observe, and reflect on direction. And think through, because that's the way I think you can. And of course, another key point comes in learning organizations, because learning organizations are organizations that can adapt, that can learn the lessons, look at themselves and say, well, we need to adjust in order to take account of this, that, and the other.
Yeah, so true. I think many of us have seen that. That's great direction. We have just a couple more minutes. Let me ask you one other question. I don't know if you have thoughts on this, but I'm interested in your experience leading across sort of multiple organizations across multiple countries and different types of stakeholders, having to lead across a diverse stakeholder group to get everyone going in the same direction. I think a lot of senior business leaders very much feel that way. Then, especially now that they're having to pay more attention to the external stakeholders, an environment particularly concerned with ESG, for example. Any guidance about building common understanding, common values, common culture when you're trying to work in that incredibly complex environment?
I think this gets to the heart of it. I mean, you may not be able to build common culture. You may not necessarily want to have common culture, except a culture that says we're prepared to work together. I think that's the most important thing. And that's that notion that whatever we do alone is not as good as what we can do with other people. And I think that's so relevant in a world where environmental or social or governance issues, particularly social issues, are so important, and social risk has got to be managed properly, because at the end of the day, business has to take account of the people amongst whom it operates. Because if you alienate the people you operate amongst, whether they are clients, whether they are in a mining context, communities, whether that's your shareholders, whether it's your other stakeholders, then you're really standing into trouble. So I think it's that seeking unity, ideally unity of effort. But if you can't find unity of effort for very good reasons, I mean, for example, in the military context, take many of the recent campaigns the military have operated in, almost anywhere, they will be operating alongside other international organizations or non-governmental organizations who have very different cultures and very different aims. Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Medicine. They don't like operating anywhere near the military because their purpose is to bring medical relief to whoever needs it. The International Committee of the Red Cross, another first-rate, outstanding organization, the relief of suffering. Hitherto or previously, they would seek to talk to everybody in the battle space. To the military, they'd be talking to the enemy because they would be looking to look after prisoners and the like.
Right.
But they will recognize as well the importance of building unity of understanding. Because if you can understand each other, then I think you can go a long way, even if your objectives are not the same. Ideally, build unity of effort, which is doing things together. Yeah. And where you can build unity of effort, I think you can think about integration of planning and execution. If you can't, find ways to reach out through liaison, regular conversation, and through key leader engagement and through other engagement. Because if you can build that unity of at least unity of purpose, then I think you can begin to break down barriers.
Right. No, thank you very much. That's fascinating, and I think extremely relevant for the kind of environment the businesses or global environment that businesses are dealing with today. So I think we're just about we're at the end of our time. So thank you very much. We've actually covered a lot of ground. I really appreciate it, Richard Shirreff, for you joining us on the call today and sharing your insights from both worlds, if you will. And thank you, everyone, for listening. If you have any questions, please get in touch, and we look forward to seeing you on our next episode of Culture Calls.
Thank you, Clive.
Great, thanks.